The atrium. The temple transformation engulfs the interior space within the exterior court. The atrium transformation works the other way, and the exterior court is taken inside. The transformation is diagrammed in this animated slide. To understand it, we must bear in mind the openness of the court to the sky. When it is taken inside, the court brings its skyward disposition with it. The atrium is a spatial device that draws down the sky, encapsulating it in an interior. The primitive belief in the gods as personifications of natural forces can help to explain the atrium idea. By bringing a portion of the sky into the interior, the atrium establishes a link between the occult nature of the gods and the mundane, everyday nature that humans must work with in order to survive and to live comfortably. The atrium formalizes the relationship between these two kinds of nature. The ancient Greeks didn't make much of the atrium idea, but it was popular with the ancient Romans, who are said to have inherited the idea from the Etruscans. The earliest known forms of atria are found in the houses and villas of the ancient Roman nobility. The insertion of an atrium separates out a particular part of the house as special, leaving the rest to develop around it as ordinary domestic space. Contrast this to the temple idea, where the inner sanctuary, psychodynamically the residence of a god, is nested inside a protective ambulatory and set aside from everyday life. This is a reconstructed view of the atrium in the house of Pansa in the ancient Roman city of Pompeii. The atrium appears as a distinctly inward-looking space. Notice how the rectangular opening in the ceiling is mirrored by a pool set in the floor, and notice how the mirroring pair establish a vertical axis within the space. This is the plan of the same house. You can see how the atrium was accessed via a narrow passageway leading directly to the street outside. The little passageway is a tight, constricted space, so the person entering the house would have been drawn through the passageway toward the bright light of the atrium beyond. One of the most striking features of atrium-type interiors is the sense of being buried, as if one were inside a chamber hollowed into the ground. Another important atrium feature is that bodies tend to move through it in curious ways. I don't mean the ancient Romans moved through the atria of their houses in curious ways. I think they just walked around them. But the deployment of the atrium idea is by no means restricted to houses. This is a reconstructed view of a swimming pool inside an imperial Roman bathhouse. The building is named after the Emperor Caracalla. It was built in Rome in about 212 AD. The pool space is a kind of atrium, much bigger than the atrium of the House of Pansa, but expressing the same spatial idea. The vertical axis of the sky and mirroring pool is clearly in evidence here, and there is even a sense that the pool space is a huge chamber hollowed out of the ground. This is an imaginary view of people swimming in the baths of Caracalla. It was painted in the 19th century by an artist called Lawrence Alma Tadema. We should treat Tadema's painting with some caution because it's very unlikely this is actually what Roman citizens would have looked like. These are Victorians at play, not Romans. Nevertheless, the painting does help us to understand something about the way human bodies tend to move in atrium space. When the atrium features in a bathhouse, it's intended to be occupied by human bodies, not circumnavigated by them. In order to actually occupy the atrium, those bodies are obliged to move through space in an unusual way. Not all of them, but those that have plunged into the mirroring pool become buoyant and therefore move about differently. As you know from your own experience, being immersed in water puts different pressures on the body. It can float, splash, paddle and swim, but it cannot walk or run. The psychodynamics of the bathhouse atrium is different to that of the house atrium. The house atrium sets up a distinction between nature as a cult and nature as cultivation. The bathhouse atrium then substitutes the occult for pleasure or luxury, perhaps even play. Aside from bathhouses, the ancient Romans used the atrium idea in another non-domestic way. This building is known as the Pantheon. It was built and rebuilt across a period of time spanning from around 25 BC to 200 AD. The Pantheon is a huge cylindrical hall crowned by an enormous dome. The dome has a large opening at the top called an oculus. Because of the relative sizes of the dome and the oculus, a shard of light pierces the Pantheon interior, moving across the walls and floor and tracking the movement of the sun across the sky. You can see from this picture how the Pantheon interior evokes something of the feeling of being in an atrium. Now, it's not entirely clear what the Pantheon was used for. One suggestion comes from a Roman historian called Cassius Dio. He lived in 200 AD. This is what he wrote about the Pantheon. It has this name, perhaps because it received among the images which decorated it the statues of many gods, including Mars and Venus. But my own opinion of the name is that, because of its vaulted roof, it resembles the heavens. The notion of heavenly resemblance is important to the history of the atrium. To follow it, we need to look at some early Christian buildings. This is an axonometric view of the Bethlehem Church of the Nativity. It dates from the 4th century AD. You can see a large interior hall, a basilica, preceded by a courtyard. The courtyard has a colonnade running around on all four sides. These kinds of courtyard are sometimes referred to by the term atrium, but we don't call it that. In the system of the prehistoric house, the enclosed courtyard preceding a basilica is derived from the stoa principle, not the atrium, and it's more useful to call it a peristyle than to call it an atrium. We'll be looking at stoas, basilicas and peristyles in a later lecture. A much better place to look for the atrium principle in the Bethlehem Church is in the octagonal form that sits behind the great basilica. This octagon was thought to mark the place of Christ's birth. In the centre of the octagon, 3 steps led up to a railing, which protected a wide circular opening cut into the floor. The opening looked down into an underground grotto, so visitors could gaze down into the cave where Christ was believed to have been born. As well as opening down into the ground, a circular opening was cut into the roof, giving the octagonal space a vertical orientation. In the Christian phase of the Roman Empire, centralised structures like the Bethlehem octagon were often used to memorialise important persons and events. This is a circular mausoleum in Rome, dating back to the days of the Emperor Constantine. He was the emperor responsible for the process that led to the Christianisation of Rome and the fading of the temple principle. This is what you see on entering the mausoleum. Although there's no pool or below-ground grotto, the space does have a strong earth-sky orientation. This is because of the way the space is structured, with a low, dimly lit colonnade encircling the high, brightly illuminated domed central space. There were important differences between the psychodynamics of centralised domed memorial structures and the atria of ancient Roman houses and public baths. The monotheistic God is a very different kind of God to those of the ancient Greeks and Romans, and its relationship to nature is altogether different. The Christian God is not the personification of a natural force, it is the ultimate cause and creator of nature. When the creator notion of deity becomes involved with the atrium idea, it inevitably triggers interest in architectural developments. One important development was the introduction of the artificial sky. As you can see, the tomb of Costanza is sealed by a dome. Light comes into the tomb through large windows piercing the cylindrical drum on which the dome rests, but the dome itself has no openings. The idea of capping the atrium with a golden sky led to some amazing developments in architecture. They were continuous across the period of Roman Christianity. But we are going to skip over them, leaping into the early 16th century, where we will look at the ways in which early modern architects continued to experiment with domes and artificial skies. We begin here inside the cathedral of the northern Italian city of Parma. The cathedral wasn't so much designed by an architect as painted by one. His name was Correggio. He painted the dome between 1526 and 1530. Please notice the painting depicts human bodies moving through space in an unusual way. Correggio has painted the bodies to seem as if they are levitating, floating upwards into the sky. Of course, the bodies are as illusionistic as the artificial sky in which they seem to float, but that's precisely the point. These bodies are not quite of this world. They're on their way to heaven. Another feature of early modern artificial skies was the painterly evocation of smoke and light. Notice the way their deployment blurs the boundary between the built and the painted architecture. In the modern world, the coupling of the dome and artificial sky wasn't restricted to religious building or to biblical themes. This example refers to a tale about the ancient Greek gods. It's called The Fall of the Giants. I'm afraid I've cropped the image so you can't actually see any giants. The figures shown here are the Olympian gods Zeus, Athena, and so on. The Fall of the Giants was built and painted by an architect called Giulio Romano around 1520. The giants are painted into one room of a pleasure palace known as the Palazzo Te in Mantua. This is the same room, only looking at the walls, not the ceiling. Notice the collision of painted and built architecture around the doorway. As well as developments in the painting of artificial skies, early modern architects rediscovered the domestic atrium. This drawing shows a design by an architect called Andrea Palladio. It's a fragment of a much larger drawing describing an entire palace layout. Leaving the Renaissance, we now leap into the early 19th century. This is a design from around 1830. It's by the same architect who designed the Altes Museum in Berlin, which I showed you last week. The design is interesting because in plan, the atrium reads as an internalised space right at the centre of the house, whereas on the section it reads as a prelude to the main body of the house, like an external courtyard. It's as if Schinkel was trying to use the entry sequence to the house as a way of capturing the transformation principle of the atrium. Here's a perspective view of Schinkel's atrium. This is the Reform Club in London, more or less contemporary with Schinkel's atrium house. It was designed by Charles Barry, the architect of the Houses of Parliament. It still stands today in St James's on Pall Mall. Here's the plan. You can see the atrium located right at the centre. Here's a view looking into the atrium at first floor level. Leaping another 90 years or so, we arrive in the 1920s, where we find Le Corbusier conducting experiments with mass housing. This is a Corbusian housing experiment called the Villa Block. The block is made by stacking identical villa units on top of one another and side by side. What is interesting about the villa unit is that it expresses the atrium principle. We'll be exploring Le Corbusier's preoccupation with stacked housing in next week's lecture. For now, we need to attend to just one feature of this housing experiment, which was the notion that each unit should have its own garden. And, since the units were stacked on top of one another, so too were the gardens. Hence, Corb would refer to them as suspended gardens. In 1925, Corb had the opportunity to build one of his villa units, garden and all, as an exhibit in a design show. The exhibit has come to be known as the Pavilion of the New Spirit. What's interesting from our point of view is that it confirms the way Corb thought of his suspended garden as a species of atrium. Notice in particular the hole in the roof with the piece of captured nature, in this case a tree, pushing through. Leaping now towards the end of the 20th century, this is a cultural centre in Paris called the Arab World Institute. The AWI was designed by Jean Nouvel architects and built in the 1980s. It contains 3 atria. The one shown in these 2 slides is designed to appear as if it were an exhibit in the museum section of the building. In the late 20th century and into the 21st, the atrium principle continues to appear in the design of houses, department stores, clubs and hotels, but it also begins to appear in the design of what is sometimes called public space. I will focus now on the role of the atrium in the construction of contemporary notions of public space. My remarks are illustrated with several contemporary atria designed by several famous architects. I've put the name of the architect and title of the project on the slides, so if you're interested, you can follow up the reference. To begin with, I want you to recollect the relationship between Odysseus and the Cyclops Polyphemus. Recollect how shocked Odysseus was by the Cyclopean way of life. To him, the Cyclopes seemed uncivilized because they lived on their own in caves and only looked after their own immediate needs, eating, drinking and procreation. Odysseus thought of himself as a civilized man. He belonged to a society with laws and places of assembly where matters could be discussed collectively. To his mind, it was the responsibility of all members of the group to gather together to decide what to do for the good of the community. Now, it might be expected that our public spaces would share some of the properties of Odysseus's places of assembly, but if we look at the way we have adopted the atrium idea, we begin to realise something entirely different is going on. One of the most important functions of contemporary public space is as a means of easing circulation through the vast urban territories that characterise the contemporary world. The additional dimension of the atrium has introduced new possibilities for the way urban space can be used. Often atrium users will simply pass through the atrium on their way to somewhere else, but sometimes they pause. When they pause, the users begin to do cyclopean things, such as eating and drinking, but they do non-cyclopean things too. The atrium user is likely to be attached to their smartphone. Occasionally, if in a group, their activities might include conversation, but live talking will always be mixed in with work on the smartphone. Although contemporary atrium use involves communication, the most significant fact about it is that people who do not know one another will spend time together physically in the same space and yet remain strangers. With the places of assembly of Odysseus's social group, all members of the group would have known one another, and if a stranger did appear, then there was a strict code for how to behave towards that stranger. The Iliad and the Odyssey also tell us that sometimes the group would eat and drink together in what was called the equal feast. Everyone present at the feast had a well-defined social role, or to put this another way, they knew their place. On occasions, a stranger might be involved in the equal feast, but the point is the stranger's presence was openly acknowledged in the behavioural codes of the group. The stranger was expected to join the group, but to act in it in the socially explicit and accepted role of the stranger. In the modern world, right up to and into the early 20th century, eating and drinking were rarely thought of as public activities. Even when eating out in a restaurant, hotel or club, modern-age eating protocols were formalised through the idea of a host and his or her guests. Of course, eating and drinking in private is no less a social affair than eating and drinking in public, and some private gatherings are more significant than others. The social significance of particular private functions depends upon the influence of the assembled group. But the fact that some private functions have broader implications for the whole of society than do others does not affect the point I'm trying to make here. The idea that strangers can eat, drink and communicate in the same place and yet remain unknown to one another is a very curious feature of contemporary public space. Turning now to the atrium illustrated in this slide, it's the Maxi Museum in Rome by Zaha Hadid architects. The Maxi is a museum of 21st century art, and the atrium is the main reception space. Zaha Hadid architects called it a large, high-reaching lobby, but that doesn't alter the fact it conforms to the atrium idea. We don't find many visitors actually eating and drinking in the Maxi atrium, but we do find strangers preoccupied with moving around the same space and crossing one another's pathways as if they are acting out a kind of spatio-temporal dance. People pass one another on the ramps and stairways suspended in the atrium space. Now you might well be looking at these photos and wondering why, if what I say is true, there are so few people in the Maxi atrium. The answer is partly to do with when the photos were taken. Mid-afternoon in August is not a busy time in Rome. But the fact there are not many people doesn't alter the atrium's architectural significance. One thing that distinguishes a work of architecture from ordinary building is that it doesn't actually have to be in use to fulfil a signifying function. Quite aside from the novel geometries and its spatial usefulness as a means of access to all parts of the museum, the Maxi atrium has a signifying function. Zaha Hadid architects are famous for their curved flowing forms, which they generate, test and control using parametric design methods. The atrium space at the Maxi is formed out of the juxtaposition of the twisting parametric volumes of the museum galleries. To generate these spatial volumes, the architects studied the fixed forms of the neighbouring buildings, but they also studied the imagined patterns of movement of potential visitors to the museum. The Maxi atrium embodies the predicted movement patterns of all the potential visitors to the museum. It is those patterns the atrium puts on show in the guise of public space. Regardless if it be empty or occupied, the Maxi atrium is a symbol of the moving bodies of all the visitors who do not know one another and never will, even though they pass in the same space. There's a further psychodynamic dimension to the contemporary atrium. Although the persons gathered in the atrium are unknown to one another, yet they all have something in common, because each person in the atrium is linked to a network of information that identifies and guarantees who they are. That information consists of electronic data collected and analysed by algorithms. It flows through the communication channels to which each individual is linked. The processes of data collection, storage and transmission are based on anonymous and universal criteria, and everyone is subject to them in exactly the same way. On the whole, this shared common ground of information is invisible to us. We might suspect it, but we can never actually see it. We just see the interface, the tablets and screens. For me, what is interesting about contemporary atrium design is the potential it has to reveal the raw materiality of information and to expose it for what it actually is.